Hello and welcome to this webinar looking at whether your organisation is compliant with the national minimum wage. My name is Matthew Ward. I'm a partner in the employment team here at Ashley Collins, and myself and my colleague Anna de Beck are going to present this webinar to you. Both Anna and I have done significant work supporting providers in making sure they are compliant with national minimum wage issues. And really the purpose of this webinar is to help you understand some of the key risk areas and some of the key principles. So, why is this a risk in the first place? None of you set out to not pay your workers the national minimum wage. We know that you'll want to give your staff the best terms and conditions you can within your financial model. And you'd think it would be a straightforward thing to ensure compliance with national minimum wage. But in practice, it's actually very complex and carries significant risk if you get it wrong. And as you can see from the quote on the slide, HMRC doesn't take into account whether you were intentionally failing to pay the national minimum wage. It's a strict liability. If you fail to pay the national minimum wage, you will be penalised. So in this webinar, what we're going to do is just to start by giving you a short overview of the enforcement regime, and then we're going to move into looking at some of the key principles you need to understand to check your own compliance, and also the key risk areas that we're seeing HMRC increasingly focus on. So a 2018 estimate suggested that 22.4% of workers are being paid less than their national minimum wage entitlement. That's a shocking statistic. And for that reason, HMRC are really investing in their enforcement team and looking to ensure that they're identifying as many areas of non-compliance as possible. And HMRC, the enforcement body currently in respect of national minimum wage, they don't currently have powers in respect of holiday pay, but that's a gap that has been suggested by the Director of Labour Market Enforcement that should be filled. So that's something to watch this space on. But currently, an HMRC inspection would not look at your holiday pay compliance, but would focus on your national minimum wage compliance. So how is it that HMRC are going to get involved with you as an organisation? Well, the first thing that can happen is that one of your staff can complain to HMRC and say that they're not being paid the national minimum wage. And that's pretty likely to trigger an inspection by HMRC into your compliance practice. The second thing that might happen might be that they might bring an employment tribunal claim or contact ACAS and say that they intend to issue an employment tribunal claim. And when they do that, ACAS will automatically tell HMRC that there's a claim being raised in relation to national minimum wage compliance. So that can also trigger an inspection. And then finally, it may be that HMRC have planned a visit to you as a business. They've got particular sectors that they're targeting, and you may fall within those sectors, or you may simply be on their list of people that they wish to come out and inspect. So it would be reasonable to expect that at some stage, every organisation employing staff would be subjected to an HMRC national minimum wage compliance inspection. So if that happened to you, what's the worst that could happen? Well, in essence, what HMRC would do is seek to identify any areas of non-compliance. And if they identify that there is non-compliance and that there are arrears due to workers, they've then got the power to require you to repay those arrears looking back over a period of 6 years from the date that they ultimately serve you with a notice of underpayment. And when those arrears are calculated, they're not just based on what the national minimum wage was at the time. The arrears are in effect separated to take into account the current level of the national minimum wage. So it's going to be more costly to you in terms of arrears to have to put things right following an inspection than if you paid the national minimum wage at the time. The other really significant factor is HMRC's power to issue penalties, which they will automatically do in relation to any arrears where you're served with a notice of underpayment. And they have the power to issue penalties for up to 200% of the value of the underpayment for arrears incurred after 1st April 2016. Prior to that, from March 2014 through to the end of March 2016, it was 100%, and prior to that, 50% of the amount of the arrears. But those amounts can all add up to really significant sums, and they are subject to a cap of £20,000 per worker. The other area of concern for employers is that HMRC will name and shame any employer who has been found to have failed to pay the national minimum wage. There's some potential to make representations to avoid the name and shame list, where it's a mistake that you've made, but it's very unlikely that you wouldn't be named and shamed if you have failed to pay the national minimum wage. So those are the enforcement powers of HMRC. There's also criminal sanctions that can apply where you haven't kept records, for example, or if during the course of the inspection that you seek to delay or mislead the compliance team of HMRC. And then the other thing that you could face in terms of national minimum wage compliance are tribunal claims or high court claims or county court claims in relation to failures to pay the national minimum wage. And we won't go into those in detail in this webinar. So I'm now going to pass over to my colleague Anna de Beck to pick up on some of the key principles.
So in light of the enforcement powers that HMRC have and the penalties that can be imposed on you, we thought that it would be helpful to remind employers of the key NMW principles. And as most of you will be aware, the national minimum wage is the hourly rate of pay to which most workers are entitled. And you have to pay it regardless of the size of your organization. And the national minimum wage increases every year in April. What do you have to pay then? Well, it is important to understand that the obligation to pay the national minimum wage is not to ensure that the national minimum wage is paid for each hour worked, but to ensure that the average hourly rate is at least the national minimum wage in the over a pay reference period. The national minimum wage is therefore calculated by dividing total eligible earnings earned in a pay reference period by the number of hours worked during that period. In order therefore to determine whether you are compliant, you need to first understand what is the pay reference period, what are the total hours worked, and what was the pay received in the relevant pay reference period in relation to those hours. So looking at those key concepts, what do we mean by pay reference period? Well, pay reference period is the period for which a worker is paid. A pay reference period is either a month or if the worker is paid less frequently, it will be a shorter period, for example, a week. We will return to risks relating to pay reference periods a bit later in this webinar. The second concept that you need to familiarize yourself with is eligible pay. And eligible pay is effectively calculated by looking at the worker's eligible remuneration received in the relevant pay reference period. What's important to know is that eligible remuneration is not always simply the wages that the worker receives in the pay reference period, but what we need to consider is exactly what pay the worker received and which pay is eligible under the national minimum wage regulations. Again, this is something that we will return to later in this webinar. Finally, what you need to look at is eligible hours. And the total number of hours worked that you will need to take into account in a pay reference period will depend on the type of work that the workers engage in. There are different rules which apply to different categories of work in relation to checking eligible hours. So workers could be working time work, salaried work, output work, or unmeasured work. And in order to calculate whether a worker is receiving the correct national minimum wage, you will therefore need to identify the type of work that they're carrying out. So what are the key risk areas in relation to ensuring the national minimum wage compliance? We see many employers fall short of the national minimum wage legislation as a result of misunderstanding the rules around pay reference periods. The first mistake that we often see employers make in relation to pay reference periods and calculating compliance is that employers take account of payments received by the worker in a pay reference period rather than payments that relate to the relevant pay reference period. So, for example, if wages for January are paid in February, those are the wages that count towards January pay. Be careful, however, a payment made any later than the following pay reference period will not count unless an exception applies. So, for example, if some wages for January are paid in March, they may not count as eligible pay towards January, and this may lead to non-compliance. The other pay reference period issue we experience is that a pay reference period can be no longer than 1 month. And many employers have arrangements where they pay on a 4-4-5 weekly basis. This often means that the fifth or the pay reference period that is 5 weeks needs to be broken down into 2 separate pay reference periods to calculate compliance, and this may often lead to non-compliance. The second area of risk that we often see is it relates to eligible pay. As already mentioned, not all payments received as wages count as eligible earnings for national minimum wage purposes. And I'll run through some examples of pay and benefits that do not count as eligible pay. So these include any enhancements, premiums, or increased hourly rates that exceed the lowest rate that would be payable under a contract in respect of the same work. So employers should be extremely careful when paying different hourly rates for some elements of work. For example, enhanced rates for working weekends, antisocial hours, or public holidays may not count. Also, allowances or payments that are not attributable to the employee's performance, such as, for example, London waiting or car allowance or travel allowance, will also not count unless they're consolidated into standard pay. Then we've got things such as expenses, benefits in kind, loans, employer pension contributions, redundancy payments, holiday sickness and maternity pay that also do not count as eligible pay. The third area of non-compliance or risk that we often come across is salaried work. We see employers often thinking that their arrangements fall within salaried work category when they don't. This then creates a compliance risk, as HMRC would check if the arrangements are lawful by applying time work calculations, which can again often lead to non-compliance if applied to salaried workers. Under the national minimum wage legislation, a salaried worker must be paid a set amount to work a set number of hours that needs to be identifiable at the beginning of the year. If these hours cannot be established, then the worker is not performing salaried work. And the issue arises where a contract does not specify exactly the number of annual hours to be worked in the year, and those hours also cannot be worked out based on the wording of the contract. This is often the case where the hours are set out as weekly hours. This is because a year is not exactly 52 weeks, and the number of days in the last week of the year may vary, and making it therefore impossible for someone who works different hours every day or week to determine the basic number of hours per year at the start of the year. And we have seen HMRC challenge pay arrangements in relation to this and in those sort of circumstances. The fourth area of risk relates to uniforms. If you require workers to wear specific uniforms and staff are required to purchase those, then any deduction made from pay in relation to those uniforms will reduce national minimum wage pay. Also, if the worker makes payment to a third party, even if it's an independent shop, but in order to purchase the uniform, then again those payments will reduce national minimum wage pay. Now, uniforms can include requirement to wear black shoes or black trousers. And there was a case in January 2019 where HMRC accused Iceland of underpaying its workers by £21 million as a result of requiring staff to wear sensible shoes and not reimbursing their expenses for this. The fifth area of risk that we thought would be worth flagging and a common area where we see non-compliance relates to travel time. And generally, travel time for the purposes of calculating hours work when determining national minimum wage compliance will fall into two categories. Time spent travelling between the worker's home and their normal place of work, which will not count as time work for determining national minimum wage pay, and then time spent travelling on business, which will count. Now, there is often a misunderstanding around what is included as travelling on business. And effectively, the national minimum wage rules say that the requirement to travel in connection with work by any mode of transport or by foot counts. The rules also say that waiting time at the departure to begin the journey counts, as well as waiting at the end of the journey. Also, travel in between different appointments counts as working time. In our experience, some employers do not count travel time as working time, which can then expose them to risk of non-compliance. I'll now pass on to Matt to look at some other areas of risk.
Thank you, Anna. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is that any payments that are made by your staff to you or that are deducted from their wages, which are for your own use and benefit, will reduce national minimum wage payments. So the first example of that would be administration fees that are attached to anything you process in relation to the payroll. So if you have attachment of earnings orders, for example, that are you're required to make, where you charge an administration fee, that will reduce eligible pay for national minimum wage purposes. In relation to DBS check fees, the approach that HMRC take is that the cost of the DBS check itself doesn't reduce eligible pay for national minimum wage purposes, but that any administration fee charged by the employer does reduce national minimum wage. We're currently involved in a battle with them in relation to an argument over where you're getting an enhanced check and the administration fee is charged by a third party and is a necessary requirement to use that third party to get the check, whether that reduces national minimum wage pay. Certainly HMRC's view is that it does. The next issue relates to training time. And this is an area, again, where recently we've seen a number of providers of all different types of services get into issues. So in terms of training time, one area of risk relates to online training. Increasingly, people are asking their employees to carry out online training, and that can often be done in people's own time. That time will be treated as working time that counts towards the eligible hours for national minimum wage calculation. Also, in relation to pre-employment training, any training that's carried out once an employee already has a contractual relationship with you, even if they've not formally started in their employment, will count as working time. So it will only be where you require someone to carry out training before they've been formally offered a job that they've accepted that the training time won't count. And then some of you may have picked up in the press that Costa Coffee have got themselves into an issue in relation to the deduction of the cost of training from workers. So they had a case where an employee worked for them for 3 days, was due, I think, about £120 in pay, but he'd also carried out training, and they had a training recovery clause in the contract of employment, and basically they didn't pay him any pay at all because they said that because he'd left so quickly, he had to pay for the cost of his training. That clause was found to be unlawful as a penalty clause, and that therefore meant that they weren't entitled to recover that money, and it reduced pay for all national minimum wage purposes, and therefore they had an NMW liability. So where you're seeking to recover the costs of training, you've got to really proceed with extreme caution. Any training provision clause that is a penalty clause will not be enforceable, and the safe approach is certainly to ensure that you still ensure that someone is paid the national minimum wage in any pay reference period where you're making deductions. The next issue we wanted to flag, it relates to salary sacrifice schemes. So any salary sacrifice arrangement that takes you below the national minimum wage will be a problem. Even if you're trying to do the right thing by your employees and offering them particular benefits, if the effect of the salary sacrifice is to take them below national minimum wage, you will be found to have been non-compliant and you will be subject to penalties. A particular issue on this, which I think is open for some challenge, is an approach that Iceland were taking. It relates to the same enforcement action that Anna referred to a short while ago. And what Iceland were doing is getting deductions made from staff to put into a Christmas fund that staff could then draw down. So in essence, a savings scheme. And HMRC have argued that that reduces eligible pay. HMRC are in discussion, I think, with Iceland about that, and Iceland are vehemently challenging the position, and we don't know the outcome of that as yet. But certainly, our advice would be, in terms of any salary sacrifice arrangements, you need to look very carefully at how those are structured to make sure that you're still national minimum wage compliant. Then the final issue that we wanted to mention has been an ongoing saga in relation to payment of national minimum wage in respect of every hour where a staff member is required to sleep in particular premises. So that's been a particular issue in the social care sector, and the current position that the courts have got to through the Court of Appeal case involving MENCAP is basically that time spent asleep where the employee is entitled to sleep, and the predominant purpose of that shift is really to sleep, but to be there in the case of emergencies, will only be the time they spend awake and working that counts for national minimum wage purposes. That's been challenged and has been appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court are sitting on the 12th and 13th of February to consider whether or not they agree with that position, or whether they actually take the view that every hour of sleep-in should count for national minimum wage purposes. It's very difficult to predict where the Supreme Court will end up on that. Our view is that the law, as decided by the Court of Appeal, is correct, and that it should only be those hours where employees are awake and working, where they are provided with suitable facilities for sleeping, and it's predominantly a shift where they're entitled to sleep. And we believe that the law is correct in that regard, but we'll know more about that next year. So those are the key risk areas we wanted to flag up, and we think for all of you listening to this webinar, you'll want to go away and look at your compliance areas around those particular issues and ensure that you're confident that you are taking the correct approach. So just to finish, just want to talk a little bit about how you can minimise risk. Record keeping is an essential part of national minimum wage compliance. The burden of proof to show that the national minimum wage is being paid is with you as the employer. So if you can't prove that someone has been paid the national minimum wage, the assumption will be that they haven't been paid the national minimum wage, and HMRC will take enforcement action. So there's not a detailed format that is set out by HMRC in terms of what needs to be covered, but certainly every employee that you have is entitled to a pay slip each pay reference period that sets out in one single document all of the pay that they've received in that pay reference period, and so they can properly understand the pay that they've had and any deductions that have been made. So you need a record of their pay, which is an obvious point, but you also need a record of their hours. And in our experience, it's keeping a clear record of hours that employers are not necessarily so clear on, and that can be particularly important where you've got some risk areas around which time counts and which time doesn't count. So you need to make sure you've got a proper format for recording the hours that people worked. So if you're presented with a challenge where someone says actually they were working a high number of hours, you can show the documentary paper trail on that point. So what we'd be encouraging you to do is to review your current practices, make sure that you've got compliance systems, and look at the particular risk areas that we've discussed in this webinar today. So what we wanted to do is just finish by saying how we can help you in relation to these arrangements. We've helped a significant number of organisations look at their own compliance, to review their current arrangements and to ensure that they are compliant. We've helped draft documentation to ensure that you're falling within the rules and that you haven't set up arrangements in an inappropriate way. And as we've talked through in this webinar, it can be easy to do that inadvertently. And sometimes we've seen contract drafting that really hasn't considered the national minimum wage risks when it's being prepared. And therefore things have been said that actually you wouldn't want to say if you were having to just show your contracts to HMRC and look at what was in there with them. We've also helped a number of providers manage their way through HMRC inspections and to try and get the best outcome from those inspections to minimise the amount of issues that may come through, and also to manage claims in the employment tribunal. And then the final area where we've spent quite a bit of time is helping people where there's fee increases that need to be negotiated, because if the work that you do is statutory funded, and the national minimum wage is increasing. You can bring to bear arguments in relation to fairness arguments around how pay is set to make sure that you are paid enough to ensure you can pay the national minimum wage. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this webinar. We hope it's been really helpful to you. If you do have any follow-up questions or points that you'd like to raise, you can get hold of us via our website, and there's details of that on this final slide. And thank you for the time today. Many thanks.